Richard Gage is an AIA architect from America. He's the founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, member of the American Institute of Architects, 28 years an architect in America, working with steel frame buildings. Richard was particularly drawn by, I believe it was a Guns and Butter radio program that he heard, a radio show that he heard when he was driving his car, where I believe it was David Ray Griffin was being interviewed about 9/11. It changed Richard's life. He pulled over his car, listened to the whole show, and he wasn't the same afterwards. Niels Harrit, PhD, is a 40-year associate professor of chemistry from the University of Copenhagen, and he's a nanotechnology specialist, and he's authored in his career 60 peer-reviewed papers. And I would like to hand over to Richard and Niels.
Thank you, Douglas. And thanks, everybody. It's really, really, really good to be back in London. And as Douglas mentioned, Niels and I had the honor to address 56 top-level fire protection professionals in the country. And they were assembled as a result of the IFPO, International Fire Protection Officers. It was a great opportunity because, I mean, everybody's wearing three-piece suits. It's not like in here. This is much more relaxed. And our task was to open their awareness to the existence of World Trade Center Building 7, which most architects are completely unaware of around the world, in America, even in New York, actually, of its destruction, the third worst structural failure in modern history. I mean, here is a 47-story skyscraper that on the afternoon of 9/11, after witnesses hear explosions around it, 7 hours after the Twin Towers came down, it drops like a rock straight down, uniformly, symmetrically, into its own footprint in under 7 seconds, in the exact manner of a classic controlled demolition. It had a few small pockets of fire. They're scattered, and they burned in the afternoon, but they were out over an hour before this building came down. So NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress with explaining all three collapses, said that this building came down, now this is 7 years later, it came down by normal office fires. So we explained this to them very carefully and showed the building coming down. And you can see this building coming down yourself on the internet. Just Google WTC7 and you'll see it coming down. We're going to be focusing today on the Twin Towers. But let me ask you first, how many of you, like me and Niels early on, were unaware of this third tower that came down on 9/11? Relatively unaware. I'm talking about today, actually, at this point, today. Some of you are aware now, but like me, but real high. 1, 2, 3. 3 people unaware. So, you know, there was a poll in the United States relative to the Twin Towers now that found that 16% of Americans believe the Twin Towers were brought down by explosive demolition, like not jet plane impacts and jet fuel, according to the official story. But this is extraordinary because this was taken before I became aware of some of the evidence I'm going to be sharing with you, along with Niels Harrit from Copenhagen. So how many of us at this point, let me ask you 3 questions. How many of us are pretty much believe the official story, as Niels and I did before. How many of us are unsure about how the towers came down? How many of us came into the room already having looked at some of this evidence? First of all, the official story: large explosion of jet fuel when the planes hit, weakening of the structural system by fire, and a gradual collapse down to the ground. Pretty much this is what we've been told. No reason to believe otherwise. How many of us are pretty much there before we begin at all? Anybody? Nobody? Nobody in this room believes the official story. How many of you are unsure? Maybe you've heard a few things. You're here to check this controversy out. Real high. You have to vote for one of these. How many of you came in here already agreeing with the evidence for explosive demolition? All the rest of you. Why don't you guys bring your friends? You don't have any friends. You're like Niels and I. Well, we're going to try to give you some information today that will help to get some of those friends back, actually. And then you can, because we stick our necks out there with the information you're going to be seeing today in the next hour. Right now, I want to introduce you to 2,500 architects and engineers who Niels and I have the great honor to represent. They're calling for a new investigation. Why? Because we are doubting the official story. Why? Because we've looked at it very, very carefully over the last 10 years. So we're going to jump right into the Twin Towers, some of which some architects actually liked it. I'm not one of them. Neither is Robert Stern, fellow of the American Institute of Architects. He says it's gigantic dumbness. So just to compare that to the sculptural purity of the building's forms is one way. But what they did really is create a square, an acre in size, and extrude it 1,400 feet in the air almost, and called it the tallest pair of buildings in the world, which it was. Compare that to the Empire State Building. Well, I don't call that design, but there was an engineering innovation here that's extraordinary, because prior to the Twin Towers, you had this forest of columns, which made planning offices really, really difficult. But what they did is moved most of the columns to the outside in the early 70s, late 60s, designing this building. And then around the core, they had 47 massive columns. Between the two is 60 feet of open office planning, which gave incredible flexibility. But they could only do that by creating these massive core columns, and between the core and the perimeter, spanning these lightweight steel trusses between the two. Lightweight, so this is where NIST focuses its criticism on the official story here. On the fires. They say that indeed those fires caused the planes caused the fireproofing to be knocked off because of the impact, and that made the trusses vulnerable to these fires. But you can see what was created here anyway with the engineering. It is really quite marvelous in many ways. But it did have low ceilings. It had marching columns around the perimeter that made some people feel like it was more of a jail cell. Compared to today's modern skyscrapers, you have these picturesque windows. Well, it was only about half occupied by many researchers. And what we have here, though, because of this structure, is a 100,000-ton heat sink. This is the reason that skyscrapers don't collapse. Right from the street itself, there was this myth that developed from this gentleman who, on the first day, had the official story in his head, the first one interviewed by Fox News. It reamed right through the building, and it came down mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense. And so this became right away the official cause of this building's collapse, destruction by by massive fires. We're going to test that theory, though. We use the scientific method. We formulate a question. How do the towers come down? We do background research and we make observations. How have other towers come down? We construct a hypothesis, our best guess. We test that with experiments, analyze the results, draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so others can build on the body of our work. That's the essence of the scientific method. We use objectivity. We lay out all the hypotheses. We don't focus on any one, our favorite one, biased against the rest. And we therefore then have several different investigations that went on early on since 2001. First, a group of volunteers with the American Society of Civil Engineers, and then FEMA came in and took over this bunch, and then NIST. The NIST report came out in 2005. What we're going to find, though, is that through all of these investigations, you have the same cast of characters who did indeed have quite a bias to ensure the federal government's official story about how these towers came down, which we're going to look at. But we're going to be looking at it with an angle toward comparing these features of this building's destruction with those typical features of controlled demolition, i.e. a sudden onset of destruction, a straight down symmetrical collapse into the footprint of the building, free fall acceleration, straight down into the building's footprint or outside, resulting in the total dismemberment of the steel structure, minimal damage to adjacent structures, sounds and flashes heard and seen by witnesses, enormous clouds of pulverized concrete, and isolated explosive ejections going off here and there, chemical evidence left behind, evidence of extreme hot temperatures, sometimes if incendiaries are used. This will be the work of Dr. Harrett, who will be looking at this chemical evidence. But all this is direct evidence of explosive destruction, and fire can't create any one of these, let alone all 10 of them. So if we have additional documentation, like from government, experts agree, foreknowledge, these are planned months in advance, this is all proof of controlled demolition. So you can get a taste of where we're heading today. Were the 3 skyscrapers did they exhibit evidence of explosive controlled demolition? First of all, these vulnerable lightweight steel trusses, which, as I mentioned, NIST hypothesized that the plane knocked the fireproofing off, making them vulnerable to the fires. Therefore, they sag. They say when they sag, that pulled in the columns. But guess what? Sagging floor trusses do not have an additional lateral load of significance, so they could not have pulled in these columns. So what does NIST do? In their final report, they show that they impose themselves, in their computer model, a 5,000-pound lateral load on every column, forcing them to fail in their computer model to try to prove how this building came down. This is called fraud, because that kind of loading could not possibly have happened. Yet, these horizontally bowing in columns did occur, but the question is, what caused them to occur? We'll be looking at that. Let's compare the features of this building's destruction to those typical features of controlled demolition. First of all, is there a sudden onset of destruction? And are there witnesses that hear sounds of explosions, that see flashes of light? Well, let's look at the oral histories, which didn't even come out to the American public and the world until August of 2005, when the city of New York was forced by the New York Court State of Appeals to release these 500 oral recordings of the first responders. What did we learn? Well, 120 of them were talking about hearing sounds of explosions, seeing flashes of light. Let's look at a few of them. We felt the ground shake. You could see the towers sway, and then it just came down. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. I heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. One floor under another, explosion in the South Tower. Figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. Seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings, it was going all the way around like a belt, all these explosions. Let's see what they're talking about. Here's the North Tower on the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Slowing it down to half size, half speed. Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, as you'll see in the movie tonight, examples of typical controlled demolitions. Especially since no skyscraper has ever been brought down by fire, even though there have been 100 much larger, longer lasting, and hotter fires in skyscrapers. But on 9/11 we have 3. But NIST focused its entire hypothesis on destruction by fire. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, flash just kept popping all the way around the building, and the building had started to explode. Let's take a look at the South Tower on the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. Sudden onset of destruction, almost free falling down. In this case, not quite as symmetrical as the North Tower, but definitely falling without jolting when it would hit the piece below, the intact, cold, hard structural steel below it. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. These reporters, one after another,
Just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the plan from.
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion.
okay, well that's working.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the plan from.
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
Just went from like.
So there are dozens, 2-3 dozen witnesses of explosions here, and you'll hear these on the film tonight as well. So we'll go a little faster through this information. But none of these witnesses of explosions appeared in any of the 20,000 pages or 14,000 pages in the final NIST report. Well, NIST says it couldn't have been a controlled demolition because it didn't start at the bottom. Well, as you can see, there's plenty of examples of top-down controlled demolitions. In fact, Mark Loiseau of Controlled Demolition, Inc. Says you can start anywhere you want in the building, like in this top-down controlled demolition. NIST says the top portion drove the rest of the building down after weakening by the fires and then destroyed itself. That's the official story. It's called the column failure theory. It's sometimes called the pile driver theory, because like a pile driver down into the water, into the soil below the water. And sometimes it's called a pancaking collapse. They're variations on a similar theme. Well, what happens when you run a lorry into a beetle? The beetle is going to be completely destroyed. Why? Because Newton's third law of motion says there's an equal and opposite destructive force. So, does it matter if we drop the beetle on the lorry? No. The top lighter part of a structure, the very lightest part with only 3/8 inch thick steel, cannot drive down the rest of the structure, particularly as fast as if it weren't even there, i.e. almost at free fall acceleration. We'll take a look. In fact, what we're seeing is the top portion is destroying itself, just like the beetle would be. And the question is, what is destroying it? Dr. Harrett will be giving us some deeper insight into this, but look at the motion here. The motion gives everything away. It is being destroyed. It's telescoping in on itself. It's very similar to a controlled demolition in the first 4 seconds. There's nothing left to drive the rest of the building down. Let's take a look here as we start and stop. Oops. We start and stop. Just like the firefighters described, like a band all the way around the building, all these explosions. None of the videos or photos show a section of building in the north or the south tower driving the rest of the building down. It itself, as you just saw, was destroyed in the first 4 seconds. After that, it looks more like the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea in 2009, a series of thousands of explosions, upward, outward, arching streamers, a geometry of fireworks, laterally, freely flying structural steel sections, trailed by thick white smoke clouds, which Dr. Harrett will be giving us some more insight into. Is it a collapse or is it an explosion? Looking at the South Tower, it begins with hundreds of explosions, which we'll take a closer look at, but this top portion is falling off the side of the building 22 degrees, so there's asymmetrical loading from this piece that's falling off. There's asymmetrical damage from the airplanes. There's asymmetrical damage from the fires. How can it do this? Complete symmetry all the way down the building, just like the firefighters described, from top to bottom. And looking close at some of those hundreds of explosions just right here, over and over again. What are we seeing? What are our eyes telling us that's going on? We're told it's an apple. What we're seeing is an orange. And that orange is explosive, completely shattering the structure from top all the way down to the bottom. Nothing hardly left. Is it a straight down symmetrical progression? Well, the building's 200 feet wide, an acre in size, each of these floors. But the debris from it is cast out up to 1,200 to 1,400 feet, well beyond the boundaries of ground zero. See the nice, neat pile of Building 7 here, a classic implosion versus the very explosive event known as the World Trade Center Twin Towers, which exhibits typical features of explosive demolition in the form of these isolated explosive ejections, sometimes called squibs, occurring here and here, which are 20, 40, even 60 stories down below the zone of destruction. NIST tells us, well, these are puffs of air being produced by that pile driver. Well, that pile driver you already saw was destroyed in the first 4 seconds. And these aren't puffs of air anyway. You can see the solids in many of these explosive squibs, which are being ejected at 200 feet per second. Physicists have clocked them. And you can see dozens of them on the left side all at once in the case of the South Tower. And as I mentioned, they're tracked at 200 feet per second. How fast is the building coming down? Well, you can see on the right a visual and get a sense of how fast it's coming down. On the left, we time it. There's 6 seconds right there, and 10. And in a dozen seconds, the building is completely shattered from top to bottom. It's almost as fast as a freely falling iPhone. 3, 2, 1. I've gotten good at that. I only use my own iPhone. It's falling freely because there's no... Got good at that too. There's no resistance down below. What happened to the 80,000 tons of resistance. Let's listen to David Chandler.
We are here tracking the motion of the roofline at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roofline as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First note that there is a sudden onset of collapse, as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of free fall.
Nearly free fall acceleration. It's going faster and faster, almost as fast as a bowling ball falling off. It doesn't slow down, it's accelerating through 80,000 tons of structural steel, almost as if it weren't even there. How does that happen? I mean, this structure is 5 times stronger than it needed to be to keep this building up. Let's look at it this way. Let's hang with a magic crane a 15-story section of this building over nothing but air. Next to it, let's put the same mass and building and structure, but with 80,000 tons of structural steel under it, 5 times stronger than it needed to be. We're going to pull the lever at once. Which one hits the ground first? Well, NIST implies that they hit the ground at the same time, essentially at free fall. That doesn't happen. This is intuitive. We learned this in physics about resistance, right? So it can't even happen. And the total dismemberment of the steel structure, piece by piece, one column from another, well beyond the perimeter of the structure that you see here, broken up into 37.5-foot lengths. Do we have lateral ejection of steel? The NFPA 921, National Fire Protection Association manual, which governs the fire and explosion investigation, tells us, look for freely flying structural sections of your building if you want to know if there was an explosion versus a collapse. Well, take a look. We have freely flying structural steel sections landing 300 to 600 feet in every direction. Check this last one out. Forward 2, 3, back 2, 3. Forward 2, 3, back 2, 3. Forward 2, 3. 45 degrees. Dr. Harrett will talk to you about what can create the lateral components of these vectors. But he'll also give you an insight into what force can be responsible for hurling a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. But I'm looking for floors, 110 floors in each of these buildings, each an acre in size. Where are they? We're looking on the right side, we see a gravitational pancaking collapse in Mexico. We see pancakes stacked up, right? Where are the floors? We see a 2-story pile of core columns, perimeter columns, miscellaneous metal on the left. Well, let's take a look. We have 90,000 tons of concrete missing. Where is it? It is pulverized in mid-air, not when it develops its gravitational potential energy and crashes on the ground, but in mid-air. That's where it is. And it lands throughout lower Manhattan in a 4-inch thick pile, as you see here, in a 3 square mile area. 100 micron particles, completely pulverized. Up to 30% of these dust samples is the concrete.
And you see, there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel. What happened to the concrete was pulverized. And I
Let's
was
keep
down
that
here Tuesday,
going in there.
and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just the site, from river to river, there was dust powder to 3 inches thick. The concrete
Governor Pataki's very helpful there.
Expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
No typewriters, no chairs, no nothing. There were file cabinets, probably about 10,000 of them, but this is the only one that they could find. It was in the basement. One steel file cabinet out of 10,000. Everything in there was pulverized, including the victims, unfortunately. We have 700 bone fragments found on the Deutsche Bank building. Where did they come from? How did they get there? Why are they so small? Well, they couldn't have come from the people in this plane because it sent its ejections out the other side of the South Tower. The North Tower, the plane that hit the North Tower, its ejections were blocked from landing on the Deutsche Bank building by the South Tower. There were 2,750 victims altogether, but only 300 whole bodies were found. 20,000 pieces altogether. 20,000 pieces of bodies, 6,000 of them small enough to fit into a test tube. 200 pieces matched to one single person. And still, 1,151 completely unaccounted for, vaporized. We'd expect these bodies to be trapped between 110 floors found somewhere at the base. They're distributed up to 600 to 800 feet outside, though, the perimeter of these buildings. What can cause that? We believe the hypothesis of controlled demolition is what's active here. We believe, especially after you hear from Dr. Harrett, that we have all 10 key characteristics of explosive destruction, that fire can't create any one of these, really, let alone all 10 of them. That with additional corroborative evidence, that this is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. After Dr. Harrett's presentation, I'd like to ask you those same 3 questions again. So keep in mind your personal reaction to this information. And we'll come back and share with you some action steps that you can take, some resources that we have available for you, and we'll play the documentary trailer to the video that we made, seen by 1 million people now. 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out. But first, let's get Dr. Harrett going, and a big hand for welcome for Dr. Harrett.